Hello, welcome to the Daily Bellringer. Don't forget to subscribe and check out the questions in the description. Today we're going to be taking a look at George Washington's presidency. All right, so George Washington, obviously, History 101, the first president of the United States, elected unanimously by the Electoral College there in 1789, but he served from 1789 until 1797. One interesting thing about George Washington, he was not part of a political party. Actually, George Washington, throughout his presidency, and this is something I'll mention again throughout this, he really thought the political parties would tear the country apart. The Constitution makes no mention of political parties, and Washington was one that definitely felt like political parties would be something that would divide the country rather than unite it. All right, but let's go ahead and get into some of the things that George Washington did during his presidency. One of the major things that George Washington, of course, is involved in since he's the first president is he's setting precedents. All right, now I know that sounds a lot like president, but precedents is basically just setting the standard or setting what is expected of others that would come later on. All right, so he knew throughout his presidency, he's like, I'm setting it up for what other presidents are supposed to do. So he was very deliberate in a lot of things that he did. One interesting thing though about Washington, he's the only president to have never lived in Washington D.C. You got to remember, it's during his presidency that they kind of choose a site for where the nation's capital is going to be. Washington is involved in the kind of the planning of the city, but he actually never lives in the White House. The White House wasn't completed or anything before he leaves office. All right, he actually lived in New York and later on in Philadelphia as president. All right, but one of the important precedents that George Washington sets is the creation of the executive department, with all the advisors and the cabinet for the president. The Constitution basically just says the president has the right to select these unelected officials to be his advisors, but Washington kind of went in and actually started to set up, okay, what are the advisors that I'm going to have? In the president's cabinet today, of course, there's 16 members. There's all these different heads of different departments, like Department of Agriculture, Department of Education, all of these different departments. But at Washington's time, he only had 4 original cabinet members. First off, the Secretary of State, who is the one who kind of deals with foreign affairs, that was Thomas Jefferson, who was the Secretary of State. Next, the Secretary of Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. The Secretary of War, which today would be known as the Secretary of Defense, was, remember, George Washington's old friend from the Revolution, Henry Knox, who had brought him the guns from Fort Ticonderoga. And then lastly, the Attorney General, who was the head legal official of the country, was Edmund Randolph. All right, and so George Washington, was known for bringing advisors together that would give him ideas of what he should do and kind of deciphering what he should do from those advisors. So he's really instrumental in setting up what the presidential cabinet is going to look like. Also, another precedent that George Washington set was accessibility to the president. Washington was extremely concerned that the president would be viewed as a monarch. And if you know anything about monarchies, the king or the royalty is never really that accessible to the common man or to the public. And so George Washington deliberately set aside hours each day to basically say, this is time that the public may come and visit me and, bring their concerns to me and everything. And so that's something that presidents did for quite a while, honestly, until, you can honestly argue until Abraham Lincoln, is that, that presidents were accessible until, we started seeing that presidents were under threat by some people from the public. So anyway, he again wanted to make sure that the president was an accessible public figure. Some of the things that George Washington did during his presidency, one of the big things he did, again, keeping with that theme of being accessible, he traveled to all the states during his presidency just to make sure that the people realized that he was, there for them and everything. But some of the other big issues he dealt with domestically, when I say domestically, I mean within our country, he dealt with the rising partisanship. So partisanship means basically a divide. Today we have Republicans and Democrats, but the divide between the parties in the government. Back then we had the Democratic Republicans that were beginning to develop, who kind of believed in a less involved federal government, and then we have the Federalists who believed in a strong federal government that began to develop. And both of those began to develop during Washington's presidency. But also Washington was concerned with things like, treaties with Native Americans, trying to move westward expansion was a big issue for him. But also there's this huge issue of this major tax rebellion that took place in Pennsylvania known as the Whiskey Rebellion, which I might do a Bellringer about later on. But it's also during his presidency that the French Revolution, of course, breaks out, and there's a lot of people that were pushing for the Americans to come in and help the French. Washington insisted on remaining neutral, saying that our country really needed to get on our feet before we could ever help anybody. So that was one of his big accomplishments, was not getting us involved in any foreign wars. But lastly, leaving office. After 8 years in office, a lot of people were begging him to stay in office. A president should, be in office, serve, and then step down. And also he was fearful if he died in office, it would give the impression again that the presidency was a lifetime position. And so he stepped down after 2 terms. He gives this famous farewell address in which, he advises Americans against, having partisanship, against political parties, and he warns against getting entangled in foreign affairs. But he dies in 1799, just a few years later, at the age of 67.